The control room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the faint metallic click of boots on polished concrete. Rows of officers stood at attention, faces expressionless under the harsh white light. At the center of it all, beneath the vast insignia of the 33rd Air Combat Wing, stood Captain Mara Vale, the only pilot without a flight assignment. The briefing had begun like every other pre-sortie ritual. Precision, protocol, hierarchy. But everyone knew this one was different. Today was the day the command would make an example of her. Colonel Rains, the flight operations chief, paced slowly before the assembled air crews. His voice was measured, but every syllable carried the cold satisfaction of authority. Effective immediately, Captain Vale's clearance to fly is revoked, he announced. Her A-10 will remain grounded until further notice. We need discipline, not theatrics. A ripple of suppressed laughter moved through the room. The sound was soft but cruel, the kind that cuts deeper because it hides behind order. Mara didn't move. Her hands rested behind her back, gloves perfectly folded, eyes fixed ahead. Rains turned toward her, almost smiling. You've had your chances, Captain. You want to prove something? You'll do it from the ground. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The officers exchanged glances. Everyone had heard the rumors that she had flown too low on a live-fire test, that she disobeyed a direct order to save ground troops pinned in a kill zone. Officially, it was called reckless conduct. Unofficially, it was called disobedience. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Tell me, Vale, what's your call sign again? The one you keep pretending to forget? For the first time, she blinked. A small motion, almost imperceptible. Then she spoke calm, even, precise. Specter One, Hawthorne. The colonel's smirk froze. Around them, the oxygen seemed to thin. A glass slipped from an officer's hand and shattered against the floor. The projector flickered behind Rains, illuminating a grainy emblem, a black sigil shaped like a winged skull. It wasn't on any current roster. Spectre Squadron had been erased from official records over a decade ago, after an operation that never existed. Someone whispered, "That unit was disbanded. All key IA." Mara's gaze didn't waver. Her uniform was standard issue, but the faded patch beneath her left shoulder, black and gold, edges worn by years of use, told a story that no one dared repeat. Outside, the afternoon sun fell across the tarmac, glinting off a row of A-10 thunderbolts resting in perfect formation. Heat shimmered above the metal, the air trembling like something alive. In that stillness, one truth lingered unspoken. She wasn't grounded because she was unfit to fly. She was grounded because she had flown where no one else would, and returned when none were supposed to. The colonel cleared his throat, trying to recover control. Dismissed. Mara turned sharply, boots echoing through the hangar corridor. Behind her, the laughter had stopped. No one was sure whether they had just witnessed defiance, or the quiet reawakening of a ghost the Air Force thought it had buried. The hangar stretched vast and empty under the desert dawn, its roof trembling with the first heat waves of morning, the air thick with the smell of fuel and oxidized metal. Captain Mara Vale moved through the aisle between aircraft with the mechanical precision of someone who had done the same motion 1,000 times before, her boots striking a rhythm that echoed like a metronome of discipline. She was alone, and she preferred it that way. Solitude was the only rank that never lied. Her A-10, tail number 912, stood at the far end of the line, wings heavy with dust, its shark mouth faded from years of desert wind. She rested her hand on the cold fuselage, the touch both intimate and professional, the way a surgeon might greet an instrument before an operation. Around her, mechanics whispered, their voices low, carrying the familiar texture of contempt disguised as humor. Someone muttered, "Grounded ghosts still come to say goodbye." And another laughed softly, but she did not look up. The quiet was her weapon. It made them reveal themselves. When the hydraulic lift hissed to life, the sound filled the silence like a sigh of memory. She began her inspection with methodical grace, tracing along rivets, cables, and turbine housings, every motion precise, deliberate, almost reverent. A faint glint beneath the wing caught her attention, a missing safety pin, deliberately removed. It was sabotage, not error. She replaced it without hesitation. No anger, no report, only a small exhale through her nose. In her world, you didn't fight small betrayals. You endured them until the right moment to answer. The intercom crackled from the control tower, a voice clipped and official. "Captain Vale, you are not authorized for maintenance on aircraft 912. She pressed the switch with 2 fingers, her tone calm, devoid of deference. "Understood, sir. Conducting visual inspection only." The line went dead. Her hand lingered over the throttle lever for a heartbeat longer than regulation allowed, then withdrew. The gesture was enough to be noticed by the young technician standing nearby. He was maybe 22, nervous, trying to look invisible but failing. His nameplate read, Darrow. He hesitated before speaking. "Ma'am, they're saying the SEALs didn't make it. The convoy's gone dark for 6 hours. His voice cracked on the last words, the kind of sound made by someone who still believed information could be trusted. Mara turned slightly, enough to meet his eyes. "No signal doesn't mean dead," she said. "It means someone's listening." The young man swallowed, glancing toward the locked operations room where flight orders were sealed. He lowered his voice. "They said you flew with them once, ma'am, in the valley." For a moment, something flickered behind her calm, not emotion, exactly, but the memory of noise, the stutter of flak, the roar of engines, the moment when sky and earth changed places. "I flew where I was needed," she said simply, and turned back to the aircraft. Darrow reached into his coverall pocket and slipped a small black chip onto the maintenance cart beside her. "Encrypted coordinates. Off-grid. Someone thought you'd want to know." He didn't wait for thanks, just walked away, shoulders tight, as if afraid the air itself might accuse him. Mara studied the chip for a long second before picking it up, sliding it into the pocket of her flight suit without breaking her rhythm. She resumed inspection, fingers running over the worn metal, like a pianist memorizing keys. Overhead, a pair of F-16 seconds screamed into the sky, their contrails crossing above the base like white scars. She watched them until they vanished into the sun, her reflection in the canopy faint but unwavering. The sound of boots approached behind her, heavier, slower, deliberate. Colonel Rains. His reflection appeared beside hers in the polished glass, his posture radiating authority crafted from habit more than conviction. "Still here, Vale?" he asked, tone half amusement, half warning. "You have a talent for disobedience." She straightened, not turning fully toward him, eyes still on the horizon. "Checking the aircraft for corrosion, sir. Old habits die harder than orders." Rains smiled thinly, stepping closer until his shadow fell across her shoulder. "You had your moment yesterday. Don't make it worse. The Pentagon doesn't like ghosts in their hangars." His voice softened, almost kind. "Be smart, Mara. You were good once." She met his reflection with her own, the symmetry sharp and cold. "Still am, sir." The colonel's jaw tightened. "You won't fly again." He walked away without another word. When his footsteps faded, she sat on the wheel strut, pulling her gloves tighter, eyes fixed on the mountains shimmering in the distance. Somewhere beyond those ridges, 381 operators were waiting, men trained to survive the impossible, now abandoned by the same system that had once called them brothers. The thought wasn't rage, it was gravity. She felt it settle in her chest, like the weight of the earth pressing upward through her ribs. The radio on her belt crackled once, a ghost signal buried under static. No words, only the faint rhythmic pulse of a distress beacon repeating 3 short tones. To anyone else, it was interference. To her, it was coordinates, a pattern she had used years ago when communication was forbidden. She looked toward aircraft 912 again, the sun catching the faint gold of the patch on her sleeve. The world around her carried on, mechanics moving equipment, engines testing on the runway, a routine that pretended order still meant safety. Yet in that endless routine, something unseen began to shift. The desert wind lifted a sheet of maintenance logs from the table, scattering papers across the hangar floor like falling leaves. Mara stood, gathering none of them. Her eyes were already on the horizon, on the silence beyond the range of authorization. In that silence, she found her resolve, not the defiance of anger, but the obedience to something older than rank. The call that only pilots like her could still hear, the duty to those left behind. And as the light rose higher through the hangar glass, illuminating the black and gold patch on her arm, the faint words beneath it became visible for the first time. Specter Division. No one spoke her name. No one dared. But somewhere over the mountains, 381 soldiers were still alive, because someone refused to wait for permission. And in that quiet, the ghost of the sky began to breathe again. Night descended over Al-Majra base like a curtain of ash, soft at first, then absolute, swallowing the desert in a silence too clean to be trusted. The wind that had carried heat all day now hissed cold through hangar seams, rattling loose metal and whispering across the wings of grounded aircraft. Floodlights cast long, trembling shadows over the tarmac, and every shadow seemed to breathe. Captain Mara Vale moved within one of them, her form merging with the metal giants around her, every step rehearsed, every sound calculated against the rhythm of the night. Inside the hangar, technicians had gone home, leaving behind the residue of ordered chaos tools half-cleaned, data tablets asleep, the faint smell of solvent mixing with kerosene. She knew the routines by heart, the guard shift rotations, the blind spots between security cameras, the 2-minute delay in the motion sensors near the auxiliary hangar door. Everything at Al-Majra ran by procedure, and procedure was the easiest enemy to outthink. She stood before her aircraft, tail 912, its surface reflecting the red pulse of the emergency lights that flickered with mechanical indifference. The A-10 Thunderbolt wasn't built for beauty, but for endurance, and tonight it looked like it was waiting for confession. Mara laid her hand flat against the fuselage again, fingers finding the same path they had followed that morning. "Just us again," she whispered, voice barely above the hum of the generators. Her breath condensed briefly in the cool air, before vanishing like it had never existed. The black chip Darrow had given her sat on the operations desk, a single piece of unauthorized truth. She slid it into the encrypted console, the screen blooming to life in a quiet surge of light. Coordinates filled the display: 34.67 degrees north, 45.11 degrees east, deep inside hostile territory, where the last signal of the SEAL detachment had vanished 12 hours ago. Terrain overlay showed the kill zone, mountain canyons, radio dead zones, anti-air emplacements marked with red triangles, a suicide grid. She studied it in silence, her pulse slow, her mind assembling a flight path no one would ever approve. Her training returned like muscle memory, risk angles, cloud altitude, thrust-to-weight calculations, all of it aligning into something inevitable. Every parameter screamed impossible, but impossible was the only language she had ever been fluent in. She retrieved a classified keycard from inside her flight suit, one she wasn't supposed to possess anymore, and swiped it against the control panel. The doors to hangar 12 unlocked with a muted clunk that echoed like the beginning of a sin. From the control tower, 2 guards noticed the light shift and began to move. She anticipated them before they even reached the steps, cutting the hangar lights and dropping the space into near darkness. The A-10 systems came alive in silence, cockpit glowing faintly as she climbed in, each motion rehearsed from years of repetition. The seat clicked shut, and the aircraft became her body again, machine and memory merging in the intimacy of purpose. The intercom burst to life. "Captain Vale, confirm your presence in Hangar 12. She reached for the switch, fingers resting just above it, then let her hand fall. No confirmation. The engines spooled to life in ghost mode, exhaust mufflers dampening the roar into a low, predatory hum. The fuel gauge blinked, reading 70%, enough for one way, maybe less. From the command building, alarms began to flash, red lights slicing through the dark. Over the radio net came the voice of Colonel Rains, strained with disbelief. Who the hell authorized that startup? No one answered. In the distance, a klaxon wailed. But the hangar doors were already rising, slow and deliberate, revealing the endless stretch of night beyond. Mara adjusted her oxygen mask, the visor reflecting the first glimmer of starlight. The sound of the engines deepened, vibrating through her ribs, a heartbeat magnified. The aircraft trembled under restraint, as if it knew what was coming. Specter One, she murmured, not as identification, but as invocation. The old name felt heavier now, like armor rediscovered after years of exile. She released the brakes. The A-10 rolled forward, nose light cutting a pale arc across the runway. Wind caught the edges of her flight suit as she accelerated, the world narrowing into the runway's white line and the rising pitch of turbines. Voices screamed through her comms channel, demanding confirmation, ordering immediate shutdown, invoking regulation after regulation. She didn't hear them anymore. The throttle moved under her hand like a living thing, pushing her toward inevitability. When the plane lifted from the ground, the sensation was not flight, but released the pure, ruthless clarity of someone reclaiming her purpose. The base shrank behind her, alarms fading into the distance. The desert opened like an ocean of shadow beneath her wings. She switched frequencies, locking onto the distress beacon's faint pulse. It was weak, but steady, a heartbeat beneath the static. She climbed to 12,000 feet, then killed her transponder, vanishing from radar like a name erased from history. The control tower's frantic chatter dissolved into noise as she crossed the border of authorized airspace. Ahead, the mountains rose like teeth, their outlines black against the faint glow of a half-moon. Between those ridges, 381 men were waiting for a miracle that command had already written off. Her HUD flickered, warning lights blooming in angry orange fuel imbalance, low ammo, incomplete maintenance. She silenced every alert one by one. The cockpit dimmed to a steady green glow, bathing her face in the same cold hue as the instruments that once defined her life. She tightened her grip on the stick, her breath leveling, her eyes locked on the horizon. Below, tracer fire streaked briefly across the ground, tiny veins of light marking the battlefield that command refused to acknowledge. Mara's voice broke the silence for the first time since takeoff, calm, almost clinical. To any ground unit receiving, this is Specter One. Hold position. Repeat hold position. The radio responded only with static, but the faint rhythm of the beacon shifted, a double pulse followed by silence. It was acknowledgement. She angled the A-10 into descent, the world narrowing into a single line of intent. Clouds tore past the canopy like smoke from a forgotten fire. Her altitude dropped, airframe vibrating with the strain of low flight. Below, explosions flashed against the terrain, distant, desperate, beautiful in their defiance. She felt none of the fear that logic demanded, only the steady pulse of inevitability. Behind her, the base commander barked orders to scramble intercepts, to block her frequency, to shut her down by any means necessary. But authorization could no longer reach her. She had already stepped outside its gravity. Through the headset came one final transmission, faint and trembling through layers of static. "Whoever you are, we see you." Mara smiled once, a ghost of expression that belonged to another life, then pushed the throttle forward. The engines answered with a roar that shook the desert awake. Above the mountains, a single A-10 cut across the stars, silent to every radar, alive to every soul still fighting below. And in that moment, the legend they had buried under bureaucracy and fear returned to the sky, not as rebellion, but as duty fulfilled in its purest form. The mountains rose ahead like the jagged bones of a sleeping giant, black ridges cutting through the silver mist, their valleys filled with firelight and moving shadows. The night sky was alive with tracers and the dying flare of mortar shells. Bursts of orange reflected in the glass of Mara's visor as she descended into the chaos below. The A-10's engines howled against the thinning air, their pitch deepening into that distinctive thunder that every soldier on the ground knew by heart, the sound of a warthog arriving when all hope had died. She banked low, skimming just above the canyon rim, the terrain radar painting the cliffs in a feverish green glow. On her heads-up display, hundreds of signals flared in and out, friendly, hostile, ghost echoes, everything bleeding together into the digital equivalent of panic. She tuned the distress frequency again, voice calm and precise, the same tone she'd used in classrooms and briefings years before. Specter One to any unit still active. Identify by pulse pattern. Static answered, followed by the faintest triple click, the seal field code for alive but surrounded. Her hands moved across the controls in fluid sequence, master arm, gun system, targeting grid, countermeasure override, each switch, like a note in a song only she still remembered. The ground opened below her, revealing a narrow gorge crawling with muzzle flashes. She saw the trapped convoy, a line of burning vehicles scattered along the canyon floor, a handful of heat signatures clustered beneath a collapsed ridge. Above them, insurgent emplacements fired relentlessly from both sides, encircling the survivors like predators circling wounded prey. Mara pulled the A-10 into a climbing turn, banking hard until the wings groaned under the stress. From this altitude, the battlefield unfolded with clinical clarity, geometry, and motion, death organized into coordinates. Her targeting pod locked onto the nearest anti-air gun, the reticle pulsing crimson as she exhaled. "Specter One, guns hot," she murmured, not for confirmation, but for memory. The GAU-8 cannon spun up, the vibration shuddering through the entire airframe, then erupted in a deep metallic roar that tore the night apart. The rounds hit in a seamless arc, a storm of tungsten that erased the emplacement in less than 3 seconds. The valley floor flashed white, then fell back into darkness. Over the comms came stunned voices, disbelief, fear, awe. Someone shouted, friendly air support inbound," and the channel flooded with desperate coordinates. Mara adjusted course without acknowledgement, the A-10 diving again, her flight path threading between canyon walls barely wide enough for her wings. Missiles streaked upward, smoke trails twisting like serpents through the dark. She released counterflares in disciplined bursts, not wasting a single one, each flare reflecting off her canopy in a wash of gold light. The first missile detonated behind her, a flash so bright it painted her cockpit white, but she didn't flinch. She was already rolling, dropping altitude. The next burst of cannon fire cutting through the ridge like thunder through stone. One position after another fell silent, the battlefield slowly transforming from a killing ground into a graveyard of failed ambushes. Down below, the trapped seals began to move, their thermal signatures spreading into organized formation. They didn't need orders. The sound of her engines had already given them one. The radio crackled again, a rough male voice breaking through the static. "Whoever you are, you just gave us a chance." Mara's reply was steady, almost serene. "Then use it. You're clear on the west ridge for 90 seconds. The A-10 roared overhead, clearing the path like a scalpel slicing through scar tissue. She strafed again, each burst perfectly timed to the rhythm of their retreat. Dust and fire rolled over the canyon floor, the air thick with smoke and the smell of burning fuel. She could see them now, small shapes moving through the dust, carrying wounded, guiding each other toward the extraction route that had once been a death trap. Every second counted, every shot had to land. Fuel warnings flashed across her panel, but she silenced them. The gauges didn't matter. Math was a luxury for people not already past the line. Her hands worked in perfect rhythm, left hand guiding pitch, right hand controlling fire, eyes never leaving the scope. Through the turbulence and smoke, she caught glimpses of the enemy columns breaking, men abandoning weapons, vehicles reversing in confusion. The comms lit up with shouting, languages she didn't understand, but fear sounded the same in every dialect. A second wave of anti-air missiles launched from the ridge, 5 at once, their contrails spiraling upward like white roots searching for her. The warning tone filled the cockpit, a rising pulse of inevitability. She pitched the aircraft into a near-vertical climb, counterflares erupting behind her in molten streaks, then cut engines for half a breath before reigniting them. The sudden shift threw the missiles off target, detonations flaring harmlessly above the peaks. The A-10 shuddered violently, alarms screaming, but she leveled out again, the horizon steady and pure. Below, the SEALs had reached the western pass. Over the radio came the brief, clipped report of command tone. "Specter One, ground element confirms exfil. Repeat, exfil achieved." The message hung in the air like something holy. She didn't respond. Her eyes were on the canyon mouth, where one last enemy truck mounted with heavy guns was lining up to fire into the retreating line. She descended without hesitation, nose pointed straight at the target, trigger depressed. The last burst tore through the truck, fire spilling outward like the breath of the earth itself. Silence followed, not absence of sound, but a silence that hummed with aftermath, the kind that exists only between the end of violence and the beginning of memory. Mara pulled the aircraft into a wide circle above the canyon, watching the smoke drift and the survivors disappear into the dark. Her HUD flickered once, warning of critical fuel. She switched to auxiliary and turned the nose toward home, though she knew she wouldn't make it that far. The radio came alive again, softer this time, reverent. "Specter One, who are you?" She didn't answer. The call sign was enough. The name carried its own weight, older than the voice asking. The clouds closed around her like a curtain, the moonlight dimming across the metal skin of the aircraft. She looked down once more at the patch on her arm, the gold threads catching the faint glow from the instruments, the emblem of a unit erased from history but resurrected tonight in fire and courage. Somewhere behind her, command channels erupted in chaos, demands for identification, accusations of rogue action, disbelief turning into grudging respect as the data streamed in. None of it reached her. She was already beyond the range of reprimand, flying in a corridor of air that belonged to no one. The horizon ahead was beginning to lighten, the first gray edge of dawn bleeding through the dark. Her final transmission came through clear and calm, the voice of a soldier who had fulfilled her purpose. Mission complete, all souls accounted. No name, no rank, no confirmation. Just silence after that, the kind that carried more truth than any report ever could. And as the sun broke over the mountains, lighting the smoke rising from the valley like incense for the fallen, every surviving SEAL who looked up into the brightening sky saw the same thing, the faint silver silhouette of an A-10 banking east, disappearing into the light. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then a single whisper passed through the comms, quiet and certain, Specter's back. The legend that had been buried in classified files and forgotten hangars was alive again, carried not by medals or headlines, but by the people she refused to abandon. In that moment, Captain Mara Vale ceased to be a rumor or a reprimand. She became what soldiers pray for when the world stops answering a ghost in the sky, bound by nothing but honor, duty, and the will to do what was right. The dawn broke over Al Madra base with a light too clean to belong to war. Thin streaks of gold sliding across the cracked tarmac and the silent hangars that now looked like hollow monuments to procedure. The alarms had stopped hours ago, yet the air still carried the residue of panic, a nervous static that clung to every metal surface. Inside the operations building, the command center buzzed with restrained chaos. Voices overlapping, printers spitting classified reports, and screens replaying the impossible. Radar footage of an unregistered A-10 taking off without clearance, vanishing from every system, and reappearing hours later above a dead zone that should have been unreachable. General Hawthorne, the highest-ranking officer in the theater, stood before the wall display, his uniform immaculate, eyes red-rimmed from disbelief rather than fatigue. Around him gathered a circle of colonels and analysts, each speaking in careful fragments that made less sense the longer they were heard. "Satellite confirms all SEALs extracted," one said, his tone equal parts wonder and fear. "Local intercepts record heavy air engagement," another added. Hawthorne lifted a hand for silence. "No authorized aircraft in that airspace," he said, each word a verdict. "Then who the hell flew it?" No one answered. The silence was heavier than accusation. At the far end of the room, Colonel Rains stood rigid, jaw tight, the edges of his authority fraying like cloth in the wind. He had signed the order grounding Captain Mara Vale, and now that signature might well become his epitaph. A technician switched feeds, revealing the final thermal image before the aircraft disappeared again. A single A-10 banking east, contrails blending into sunrise. Hawthorne stared at it for a long time, the reflection of the screen flickering in his glasses. "Specter One," he muttered, the words like a ghost drawn back from memory. The room froze. Everyone knew the name, though officially it had never existed. Files marked Specter Division had been buried under layers of classification, sealed after operations that no tribunal dared to record. "Sir," an intelligence officer began carefully, "Specter Squadron was decommissioned 12 years ago. Every pilot KIA. Hawthorne's voice was soft but unyielding. Apparently not all of them. Outside, the base stirred with rumors spreading faster than orders. Mechanics whispered about seeing the hangar lights flare in the night, about the roar that shook the desert and then vanished. Some swore they'd heard the engines overhead during the early hours. Others claimed they'd seen the A-10 silhouette against the dawn, wings scarred but unbroken. Each story grew sharper in the telling, until even disbelief began to sound like faith. By mid-morning, a convoy of armored vehicles rolled onto the airfield, dust spiraling around them in disciplined chaos. A field tribunal had been assembled, improvised justice, built from panic and reputation. Colonel Rains was summoned first, standing before a semicircle of officers whose faces carried the calm cruelty of bureaucracy. "You failed to maintain control of your command," one said. "You permitted the theft of military property." Rains replied through clenched teeth. "I followed procedure. I grounded her for insubordination." The general's gaze cut through him. "You grounded the only pilot who still remembered why this uniform exists." The statement hung in the air, raw and absolute. For a moment, the entire mechanism of authority faltered under its own reflection. Outside the tent, reporters waited with cameras. Chasing fragments of truth the Pentagon had not yet decided how to deny. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, the rescued SEALs were being debriefed, their bodies bandaged, their eyes hollow with exhaustion, and something deeper, the kind of gratitude that refuses translation. They spoke in brief, clipped sentences. Female voice on comms, A-10 support, unmarked call sign. Saved us all. None of them had seen her face, but every one of them would swear she was real. By afternoon, the base had turned into a hive of contradictions. Celebration buried under reprimand, awe tangled with bureaucracy. Official memos called the event an unauthorized intervention under investigation, while soldiers on the ground called it a miracle. In the hangar, technicians were ordered to audit every aircraft, to confirm no damage, no fuel discrepancy, no trace of what had truly happened. Yet, on the concrete floor of Hangar 12, beneath the wheel strut of aircraft 912, someone found a single glove regulation issue. Black leather, initials burned faintly into the lining. MV. That evening, as the desert cooled and the last transport plane lifted toward headquarters, General Hawthorne remained alone in the command room, staring at the classified files now reopened on his terminal. Each page detailed missions erased from public record, close air extractions, rescue operations executed under radio silence, pilots who flew into storms of fire and returned unseen. At the bottom of one page, a phrase repeated like a creed: "Once a soldier, always a protector." He closed the file slowly, the edges of his hands trembling just enough to betray conviction. He turned toward the window, where the runway stretched empty under the fading light. "If she's still alive," he murmured, "she's earned more than punishment." Outside, wind moved across the tarmac, carrying with it the faint scent of burnt fuel and iron, the ghost of flight. Somewhere far beyond that horizon, Captain Mara Vale flew low and steady, conserving fuel, following a heading that no satellite could predict. She did not need permission, or forgiveness, or even acknowledgement. What she needed was distance enough sky to let the noise of the world fade into the hum of engines that still obeyed her hands. Her radio remained silent, switched off not by defiance, but by purpose. The only sound inside the cockpit was the soft ticking of instruments and the wind's relentless whisper along the fuselage. Beneath her glove, the gold thread of her patch glimmered faintly each time lightning flickered in the distant clouds. Ahead lay the coast, a sheet of silver beneath the first stars. Back at Al Majra, the lights of the base dimmed one by one, until only the runway markers remained a line of pale dots stretching into blackness. General Hawthorne watched them from his window, hands clasped behind his back, eyes reflecting both pride and regret. "You can court-martial a soldier," he said quietly, "but you can't chain a conscience." His aide looked uncertain whether to reply. "Sir, shall I prepare the statement?" Hawthorne nodded once. "Say the operation succeeded. Leave out the name. Legends don't need paperwork." Outside, the desert night deepened, wide and merciless, yet strangely peaceful. Far above it, unseen by radar and unknown to command, a single aircraft continued east, its navigation lights dark, its engines whispering like memory. Inside, Captain Mara Vale adjusted her heading and let the horizon widen before her. Behind her lay the machine of war. Ahead lay silence and sky and the unspoken promise that had driven her through every rule she'd broken. No one left behind. The world would write its own version of events, embellished, sanitized, or buried under secrecy. But among the rescued, the story would endure exactly as it happened. When the radios went dead and the world turned its back, a ghost appeared in the sky and carved a way home. And in that story, whispered from one unit to another, passed like a coded prayer through every barracks and outpost, the legend of Specter One lived not as defiance, but as the last unbroken fragment of honor in a world that had forgotten its meaning. The official reports began to circulate 3 days after the rescue, their language sterile, their conclusions designed to erase the human pulse that had brought 381 men home alive. They called it a probable systems malfunction, a sensor anomaly, a possible interference with radar data. In those pages, no pilot was named, no aircraft acknowledged, and no command chain claimed responsibility. The success was rewritten into an accident, the kind of bureaucratic ghost story that survived only as rumor among soldiers who had seen too much to believe in coincidence. At the Pentagon, polished shoes clicked across marble floors, and voices echoed behind closed doors, heavy with classification. Committees were formed, subcommittees were added, and every question about Specter One dissolved into a swamp of cautious phrasing. The phrase unauthorized heroism appeared once in a transcript, quickly redacted before the document reached final distribution. It was easier to sanitize the miracle than to accept that courage could operate outside the chain of command. Meanwhile, at a secure airfield far from any map, Captain Mara Vale lived under the illusion of reinstatement. Her new orders read temporary reassignment pending review, a phrase that meant neither freedom nor punishment. They had moved her to a remote base carved into the desert rock, a place where silence was mandatory and loyalty was measured by how little you asked. Her quarters were small, windowless, the kind that looked like a test rather than a shelter. Each morning she reported to flight readiness training, each afternoon to briefings about missions that would never launch. The men she worked beside were strangers, younger, still bound to procedure like a religion. They treated her with cautious politeness, the way one might handle a weapon still loaded. Some admired her reputation in secret. Others whispered that her file was cursed. During mess hours, they would glance at her patch regulation issue now, stripped of its gold, the emblem of the Specter division replaced with a blank field of gray. She didn't correct them. Let them believe she had been rebranded. It was safer that way. Only the base commander, an old intelligence officer named Briggs, seemed to understand what her presence really meant. He carried himself like a man who had traded belief for survival, his uniform pressed to perfection, his voice always low. "They're watching," he told her one evening as they stood by the runway, watching the heat fade from the concrete. "They want to see if you'll flinch. They'll push until you do." Mara's answer was simple, almost gentle. "I don't flinch, sir. I fly." Briggs gave a tired smile, the kind reserved for ghosts that refuse to die. The next morning, her bias test began. She arrived at the flight hangar to find her. A-10, waiting, its panels stripped, its avionics replaced with training modules that would ground any pilot below veteran grade. The maintenance officer, a boy barely 20, met her with forced authority. "Regulation says no flight until the diagnostics clear," he recited, eyes avoiding hers. "Procedure change from command. Randomized safety check." She nodded once, recognizing the trap for what it was, not a rule, but a probe. She spent the day rebuilding systems piece by piece, not because she had to, but because she needed to feel the machine breathe again. Her gloves left faint smudges on the steel. Her hair clung to the sweat along her neck, but she worked in silence, the rhythm of labor replacing the rhythm of flight. By dusk, the aircraft was operational, every line double-checked, every fault neutralized. The maintenance officer returned, clipboard trembling slightly in his hands. "You weren't supposed to fix it that fast," he admitted. "They said it would take 3 days." Mara met his gaze calmly. "Then they've forgotten what I am trained for." Later, in the barracks, a message flickered onto her terminal. No sender, no trace, just coordinates. The same desert grid she had flown over during the rescue, the same canyon where the SEALs had been trapped. Beneath the numbers, a single phrase, "Return flight incomplete." She stared at it for a long time, hearing again the echo of gunfire under rock, the hiss of sand against glass, the voice that had whispered through static, "Whoever you are, you just gave us a chance." That night, she walked to the edge of the runway, the desert stretching endless beyond the perimeter lights. The moon hung low, pale and patient, and the air smelled of fuel and dust. She knew she was being watched. Cameras tracked every movement, every breath. Yet there was no rule against standing still, no protocol forbidding memory. She closed her eyes and pictured the faces of those she had saved, the voices she would never meet again, the weight of 381 heartbeats she had carried on her wings. Behind her, footsteps approached Briggs again, his shadow merging with hers on the tarmac. "You know they'll never clear your name," he said quietly. "The system can't reward what it didn't authorize." She opened her eyes, gaze fixed on the horizon where sand met starlight. "They don't need to clear it," she replied. "They just need to remember it happened." He nodded once, almost in respect, then handed her a small metal box, old, dented, edges scarred from transport. "This came for you," he said. Inside, wrapped in canvas, was her original patch, the black and gold. Specter insignia, edges frayed but whole. She ran her thumb over it slowly, feeling the threads like a pulse. "Where did you get this?" she asked. Briggs exhaled through his nose. "One of the SEALs sent it, said you dropped it that night, said they wanted it returned to the only one who earned it." For a moment, the mask of discipline slipped, and something close to warmth flickered behind her eyes. She closed the box and handed it back. "Keep it safe. Legends don't survive paperwork." Briggs hesitated. "You could leave, you know, walk away before they make you disappear for real." She shook her head, a faint smile ghosting her lips. "And let them think they've buried me? Not yet." The wind rose then, tugging at her flight suit, carrying the faint scent of rain from somewhere far beyond the horizon. She looked up at the stars, at the infinite sky that had always been both home and exile, and felt the old hunger stir again, not for vengeance, but for clarity. Somewhere deep in the control bunker, a sensor pinged softly, detecting an unscheduled power surge from Hangar 4. Engineers would find nothing by morning, only a line of footprints in the dust, leading to the threshold of the night. In the stillness between seconds, a single engine coughed once, like memory reawakening. Mara stood motionless, eyes on the darkness beyond the runway. "They want to test a ghost," she whispered. "Then let them see what one looks like." Her voice vanished into the wind, carried far across the dunes where no microphone could follow. And in that moment, as the stars reflected off the silent metal of aircraft 912, the world's rules bent just slightly, as if acknowledging her truth that obedience could be a form of cowardice, and silence, when chosen, was the highest kind of defiance. The desert around the remote base never truly slept. It only changed its rhythm, exhaling heat by day and drawing in silence by night. Each evening, the sky turned to a dull silver, stars hidden behind a haze of dust, and the world took on that fragile stillness that precedes revelation. Captain Mara Vale walked through the corridors alone, her boots whispering against concrete, the sound echoing faintly down steel-lined halls built to contain secrets more dangerous than weapons. Her body obeyed the motions of routine inspection, report, rest, but her mind moved elsewhere, tracing invisible lines between questions that no one dared to ask. The message she had received still burned in her thoughts, its coordinates seared into memory like a scar she could not cover. Someone out there remembered, someone with access to the kind of encrypted channels only high command could touch. It wasn't a threat, it was a reminder, a pulse in the dark that said you are not alone. For 3 nights she tried to ignore it, burying herself in mechanical work, polishing flight instruments that would never be used, checking fuel gauges on grounded craft as though they still belonged to her. Yet every system she touched seemed to hum faintly, as if recognizing the hands that had once guided them through chaos. On the 4th night, the hum turned into a sound faint at first, a rhythmic interference on the comms line, too structured to be static. She listened, head tilted, heart steady. 3 long pulses, too short. A pattern old enough to make her throat tighten. It was a field code from Specter Division, one used during blacked-out missions when radios were jammed and silence was life. She pressed the receiver against her ear, hearing the coded message repeat 3 times before cutting out entirely. No words, no signature, just a ghost knocking on the door of memory. The next morning, she found Briggs waiting by the operations table, a coffee mug in one hand and a folder he pretended not to guard in the other. His eyes were red-rimmed, and the way he looked at her told her he already knew. "Something hit the comms grid last night," he said. "Encrypted, untraceable. HQ says it's residual noise from solar interference." She met his gaze quietly. "And what do you say?" He sighed, lowering the folder. "I say you have old friends who don't know how to stay dead." He slid the folder toward her. Inside were photographs printed from infrared satellite feeds, blurry images of a downed drone convoy scattered across a mountain range 200 miles east of Al-Majra. Over the images, someone had scrawled a single phrase in black marker: Specter Flight Corridor. Her pulse slowed, not from fear, but from understanding. Someone was mapping the same skies she had once flown, resurrecting routes the world had erased. "Who sent this?" she asked. Briggs hesitated before replying. "A technician in DC calls himself Darrow." The name struck her like a chord struck true. The young radar engineer who had slipped her that black chip, the one who had known without being told. Briggs continued, his tone low. "He's been reassigned to data recovery, but his access logs show he's been pulling declassified fragments from old operations. Specters mostly. Command thinks he's chasing ghosts. I think he's building something." Mara closed the folder carefully, the edges cutting into her palms. "Then he's already in danger," she said. Briggs nodded. "He knew that when he reached out. You were the message's only destination." That evening, the desert wind returned, heavy with sand and the faint metallic scent of rain. Mara sat in her quarters, lights off, listening to the static hum of the base's communication array. Every few minutes, she adjusted the frequency by a fraction, chasing echoes that didn't belong. Finally, just before midnight, the receiver clicked twice, then held a steady tone. A new message emerged clearer now, deliberate. "Specter One," a male voice said, filtered through encryption distortion. "If you can hear this, they're reopening the files. They want the tech, not the people. They'll erase the names again, including yours." She didn't answer, didn't even breathe. The voice continued, urgent but controlled. "They found the archive under Project Halberd. Everything you flew, every target you saved, it's in there, and it's being rewritten. If they purge it, you'll die a second time. I can't stop it alone." Static swallowed the words, but the coordinates that followed were unmistakable, the same canyon where she had disobeyed the order to abandon the seals. The connection cut out, leaving the room silent except for the low buzz of electricity. She sat there for a long time, the weight of the message pressing down like a physical presence. To go back meant exposure, maybe arrest. But to stay meant letting the truth vanish into official silence. When she finally rose, her decision was already made. She retrieved the metal box from her locker, the one Briggs had returned to her, and opened it again. The Spectre patch lay inside, edges frayed, color faded, yet somehow more alive than anything else in the room. She pinned it back onto her flight suit with steady hands. The sound of the clasp clicking shut felt like a heartbeat resuming after too long a pause. Briggs found her an hour later in the hangar, standing beside the stripped A-10, her posture calm but unyielding. "You're leaving," he said, though it wasn't a question. "If I am," she replied, "it's because the truth deserves air before it suffocates." He rubbed a hand over his face, then handed her a keycard, the same kind that had opened hangar 12 weeks before. "They'll court-martial us both," he said. "Maybe worse." She gave him the faintest ghost of a smile. "Then let's make it worth the paperwork." He followed her to the control panel, inputting overrides he'd sworn he'd forgotten. The hangar doors shuddered, dust rising as the desert wind swept in. Somewhere deep in the base, alarms blinked half-heartedly, confused by authority codes too old to exist. Mara climbed into the cockpit, the seat molding to her like memory, her movements slow and sure. She powered up only half the systems, leaving the others dark to avoid detection. The engines rumbled once, a low, questioning growl. Briggs stood at the edge of the runway as she taxied forward, his silhouette a small defiance against the widening light. Over the comms, his voice came through, roughened by wind. "Whatever they buried, bring it back alive." She looked toward him once, then forward again. "No promises," she said, "just intentions." The engines rose to full pitch, dust spiraling around the aircraft in concentric waves. The A-10 leapt from the runway into the silver night, vanishing between the clouds like a memory refusing to fade. Back in the control tower, Briggs shut down the alarm system manually, erasing logs, deleting timestamps. When the investigators arrived at dawn, they would find nothing except an empty hangar and a single word scrawled across the maintenance board in black grease pencil. "Spectre." Above the desert, the signal that had begun as static now pulsed through the comms network, spreading from node to node like a heartbeat revived. Every operator, every ground soldier who had once heard that name looked up from their consoles, uncertain if what they were hearing was real. And in that moment, across distances measured in deserts and oceans, a whisper threaded through the static: "Specter One, airborne." It wasn't defiance this time. It was confirmation, the acknowledgement that some ghosts never die because the world still needs them to fly. The desert stretched endless beneath her wings, a pale wasteland of wind-carved stone and whispering dunes, each ridge glowing faintly under the cold starlight that silvered the world into silence. Captain Mara Vale adjusted the throttle, feeling the vibration move through the frame like a heartbeat, the old machine remembering her touch after too long in captivity. The A-10 climbed smoothly, its engines a deep, steady hum that cut through the night like a pulse through still water. She flew without navigation lights, instruments dimmed to half intensity, the HUD glowing faint green against the darkness of the canopy. The call sign, Specter One, blinked quietly on the console, no transponder, no signature, just a ghost moving through air that no radar could claim. She leveled out at 10,000 feet, scanning the horizon. Below her, the desert looked alive, rippling with heat ghosts that fooled even the most sophisticated sensors. Ahead, the coordinates from Darrow's message flickered in her mind: 34 degrees north, the 45 east, the valley where the archive was rumored to lie, buried beneath the shell of an old research compound abandoned after the war. She switched her communication receiver to passive, catching the low hum of encrypted frequencies, the telltale chatter of drones patrolling airspace that officially didn't exist. They were searching for her already, their AI operators tracing anomalies, their radars sweeping like invisible knives through the night. Mara exhaled slowly and began to dance between them, her movements precise, disciplined, effortless. She dropped altitude, flying so low that the tips of her wings brushed the echo line of the dunes. Every turn was calculated, every throttle adjustment exact, the product of years of training that had never been erased by bureaucracy. The A-10 was heavy, brutal, meant for slow endurance, not stealth, but under her hands it moved with impossible grace, obeying the subtle mathematics of instinct. The desert blurred around her, the machine's roar fading into a low growl that blended with the wind. Her eyes flicked over the instruments. Radar sweep clear. Infrared signature minimal. Fuel levels stable. She smiled faintly, remembering what her instructors had once said. You can't hide an A-10. She had spent a lifetime proving them wrong. The trick was not to hide from the enemy's eyes, but from their expectations, to make the improbable seem routine until it passed unnoticed. Above her, a surveillance drone banked, its sensors scanning in wide arcs. She rolled the aircraft gently, using the reflection of the moon on its belly as a shield, the light refracting off her canopy and dissolving into the shimmer of the desert. The drone passed overhead, oblivious, leaving only the faint tremor of displaced air. Minutes stretched into an hour, the horizon never changing, the monotony broken only by the pulse of her instruments. Then, through the static of the receiver, a faint signal bled through. 3 clicks, a pause, 2 clicks. Darrow's code. She adjusted course 2 degrees west and descended again, the ground rising to meet her. The target grid appeared on her screen, a cluster of derelict hangars half buried in sand, their roofs collapsed, metal twisted by decades of heat. No lights, no guards visible, yet the radar pulse showed movement beneath the surface. Someone was home. Mara banked once more, circling high above the ruins, her mind shifting into the calm precision of combat thinking. She studied the layout. 3 entry points, 1 main corridor likely reinforced, 2 secondary vents perfect for aerial breach. Her ammunition count blinked in amber limited rounds, no missiles. Fine. She wouldn't need them. The mission was extraction, not destruction. She switched the weapons systems from auto to manual, locking the trigger response to her own rhythm. Below, faint glimmers of metal betrayed the presence of drones, autonomous guardians shaped like insects, their rotors barely audible. She descended another 100 feet, cut engines for 2 seconds, then reignited them, using the thermal surge to blind their sensors. The drones fired, tracers slicing upward in chaotic lines, but she had already moved. The A-10 twisted through the canyon, wings clipping the air with dangerous precision, rounds exploding harmlessly behind her in flares of dust and flame. She returned fire once, a short controlled burst from the GAU-8 cannon that shattered the lead drone midair, its pieces scattering like sparks across the valley. The others retreated, their algorithms recalculating what kind of machine could outfly them in terrain designed to kill. The answer, she thought, was one flown by purpose, not permission. As the dust settled, The comms crackled again. Darrow's voice came through, warped but urgent. Specter One, visual confirmed. You're off the grid, but they'll trace you soon. Archive node located at sub-level 4. They're wiping it. She could hear his breath quicken, the sound of typing in the background, systems fighting for control. If they erase the data, Spectre Division dies on paper forever. She steadied her voice. Then we stopped them. The connection faded to static. She lined up her approach, the hangar mouth yawning open like a wound in the sand. Inside, faint lights glimmered security systems, automated turrets, motion sensors alive with false comm. She throttled down to minimum power, extended flaps, and fired a single flare into the dark. The light burst, dazzling the sensors, freezing their calibration long enough for her to act. With a sound like thunder muffled by distance, she released a small pod from the underbelly of the aircraft, an old recon module she'd rebuilt herself. It hit the ground, unfolded, and began transmitting. On her display, lines of data appeared: temperature gradients, heat signatures, coded entry locks, every piece of information she needed to breach the archive remotely. Her hands moved over the controls, each motion practiced, deliberate, intimate. She had always believed flying was a conversation between will and gravity, and now that dialogue became scripture. She guided the A-10 into a holding pattern above the ruins, sensors feeding her data, algorithms aligning under human instinct. The system tried to warn her low altitude, high risk, unknown defenses, but she silenced it with a tap. Machines measured danger, soldiers measured necessity. Within minutes, her onboard recon cracked the archive firewall. She saw the data streams flicker: mission logs, pilot records, combat telemetry, all marked for deletion. She redirected the sequence, looping the purge into the backup node. For every file they tried to erase, she made 2 copies, sending one to an untraceable channel Darrow had left open. The act was surgical, silent, almost tender, a resurrection disguised as theft. Below, alarms flared, searchlights cutting through the dust as ground patrols scrambled from hidden bunkers. She ignored them, her focus locked on the screen where the Spectre insignia reappeared, bright and clear after 12 years of exile. "Welcome back," she whispered, voice barely audible above the engine's hum. The aircraft trembled as a missile-lock tone screamed through her headset, but she didn't flinch. She had one more maneuver left to prove what they had always feared: that ghosts don't retreat, they vanish by choice. She dropped to 200 feet, throttled forward, and released a cloud of countermeasures that flared into a false formation of heat signatures across the sky. The missile streaked upward, chasing the decoys, detonating in a bloom of fire that lit the valley like dawn. She flew straight through the explosion, the A-10 emerging on the other side blackened but whole, the archive below engulfed in smoke. The files were safe now, the data secured, the truth reborn. Her radio clicked once, Darrow's voice faint but clear. "Transfer complete. They can't bury it anymore." She smiled, exhaustion sinking into her bones. "Then the world remembers," she said, pulling the A-10 into ascent. The ground fell away, the horizon widened, and the first hint of sunrise bled into the eastern sky. The machine groaned beneath her, battered but obedient, a relic carrying the weight of every ghost who had ever refused to vanish. The desert shimmered below like an ocean of forgotten wars. She adjusted course north, where the clouds thickened and the signals faded, her voice steady as she switched to the closed Spectre channel. "Specter One," she said softly. "Mission data secured, returning to shadows." And with that, the A-10 turned east, engines rumbling low, its wings catching the last fire of dawn before melting into silence, a phantom reclaiming the sky it had never truly left. The storm arrived without warning, rolling across the desert like a moving wall of shadow, swallowing horizon and sky in a single breath. The first gust hit her aircraft with the weight of a fist, shaking the A-10 so violently that the canopy rattled against its frame. Instruments flickered, alarms flared, every light on the console painting her face in red and amber pulses. Captain Mara Vale steadied the stick, her voice calm, a whisper of discipline against the chaos that roared outside. The desert below was gone now, replaced by an ocean of dust and lightning, a blind world where direction meant faith more than science. She reduced altitude instinctively, dropping below the worst of the turbulence, the engines straining against the thick air. Static filled her headset, erasing Darrow's voice mid-sentence, leaving only fragments of code and the faint hum of dying frequencies. Tracking you copy signal loss. Then silence. She tried twice to re-establish the link, her gloved fingers dancing over the controls, but the interference grew louder, swallowing every attempt in white noise. The storm had cut her off completely. She was alone again, the sky her only companion. Through the swirling haze, she could still see the glow from the ruins far behind her, the last flicker of the data vault she had saved, the physical proof that the truth had escaped their control. But between her and safety stretched 200 miles of no man's airspace, patrolled by interceptors whose orders would now be clear: recover the stolen archive or erase the pilot who carried it. She knew they were coming before the radar confirmed it, the faint blips materializing at the edge of her scope like ghosts given form. 2 signatures at first, then 4, moving fast, cutting through the storm with military precision. Her training settled over her like armor, cold and familiar. She banked east, minimizing profile, shutting down every non-essential system to avoid detection. The A-10's engines dropped to a low rumble, each vibration echoing through the frame like a heartbeat slowed to near stillness. She breathed once, long and controlled, feeling the tremor of adrenaline under her ribs. The first missiles came seconds later, thin spears of heat slicing through the clouds, their guidance systems hungry for anything alive. She didn't counter immediately. She waited for them to commit, for the perfect point where mathematics surrendered to instinct. At the last moment, she rolled sharply, diving straight into the storm's heart. Lightning flashed white against the wings, thunder shook the fuselage, and the missiles missed by meters, exploding in twin blooms of fire that were devoured instantly by the wind. The aircraft shuddered but held, her hands steady on the controls. Another pair followed, fired blind through the dust, and she answered this time, releasing counterflares in a pattern too complex for the machines chasing her to predict. The sky became a battlefield of light streaks of gold and crimson tearing through the black, vanishing into the whirling darkness. Her radar screamed again, closer now. The interceptors had broken formation, splitting to flank her from both sides. They were faster, newer, designed for speed and precision, but they lacked what she carried, the memory of surviving long after logic had surrendered. She cut the throttle suddenly, letting the A-10 drop like a falling stone, the altimeter spinning as the storm swallowed her completely. The world turned weightless. For one suspended heartbeat, she felt both the terror of falling and the peace of letting go. Then she reignited the engines, pulling up hard, the G-forces slamming her back into the seat as the horizon tilted upright again. One of the interceptors overshot, blinded by its own pursuit radar, and in that single moment of chaos, she fired. The GAU-8 cannon roared to life, its sound deeper than thunder, the tracers carving a molten path through the rain. The jet disintegrated midair, pieces scattering like burning leaves. Her voice, when it came over the open frequency, was steady and unhurried. "Stand down. You're following the wrong target." The response was immediate. A man's voice filtered through distortion, clipped and cold. "Negative, Specter One. Orders are to neutralize. You are classified hostile." The storm cracked open around them, lightning illuminating the sky like a camera flash, revealing a crime scene. For an instant, she saw their formation clearly: 3 remaining aircraft, triangulating, herding her toward the mountain range to the north. She could outfly them, perhaps, but not without burning the last of her fuel. Escape meant survival. Engagement meant legacy. She chose legacy. She climbed toward the dark ridge, the altimeter ticking upward, the engines howling in protest. The mountains loomed like giants buried under sand, their peaks lost in the storm clouds. On her radar, the interceptors followed, closing fast. She armed the last of her countermeasures, checked the gun feed, and whispered something that wasn't quite prayer. "Once a soldier," she said under her breath, "always a protector." The first enemy locked on at 2 miles. She could hear the missile warning tone rising, steady, insistent, like a heart monitor approaching flatline. Instead of evading, she turned into it, diving toward the narrow canyon that cut through the mountain base. The missile followed, screaming through the storm, its guidance system confused by the magnetic anomalies of the canyon walls. At the last second, she rolled beneath a rock arch and pulled vertical, the missile striking stone and erupting in a shockwave that threw her skyward. Dust and flame chased her as she climbed, wings trembling, the metal groaning under the strain. The second interceptor came next, emerging from the smoke with guns blazing, tracer rounds tearing the air around her canopy. She banked left, letting instinct guide her hands, the A-10 rolling low enough that her wingtips sliced through the mist. She could almost feel the enemy pilot's confusion. How was a grounded relic outmaneuvering a machine half its weight? She cut power, then reignited it in one seamless motion, slipping behind his blind spot. The cannon fired once, short and final. The jet exploded, the debris falling like meteors into the canyon below. Two remained. Her radar painted them bright and sharp, closing from opposite vectors. They would converge in less than a minute. She pushed the throttle forward, the engines roaring, every alarm screaming. The A-10 surged upward into the heart of the storm, wings shaking, metal groaning. Lightning danced along the fuselage, crawling across the paint in blue veins. She let the sky swallow her whole, flying by instinct, by faith, by that quiet rhythm of discipline learned in 100 missions that never officially happened. For a heartbeat, everything went still. The storm paused, the instruments steadied, the noise faded into absolute silence. In that silence, she heard her own breath, calm and measured, the heartbeat of a pilot who refused to die obediently. Then the storm returned, violent and alive, and the last two interceptors vanished into it, searching for a target that no longer existed. She leveled the aircraft above the clouds, the world opening beneath her in fragments of moonlight and lightning. Fuel low, comms dead, systems bleeding power but alive. Against all logic, still alive. The horizon glowed faintly where dawn waited, hidden behind miles of storm. She set her course toward it, one hand resting on the throttle, the other tracing the worn patch on her sleeve. Behind her, the radio crackled Darrow's voice, faint, breaking through layers of static. Specter One, data received, they know now, you're a myth again. She smiled, eyes fixed on the distant light. Not a myth, she said softly, just unfinished. And as the storm closed behind her, sealing her path like a secret rewritten by thunder, the last living ghost of the Spectre division flew onward, carrying the truth through a sky that refused to forget. The first light of dawn bled slowly through the thinning clouds, a pale wound opening above the mountains where the storm had torn the night apart. The air smelled of burnt ozone and dust, and the sky shimmered with the faint residue of heat still rising from the wreckage below. Captain Mara Vale steadied the A-10, her fingers moving across the console with deliberate precision, silencing alarms one by one until the cockpit fell into an almost holy quiet. The instruments blinked weakly, fuel gauges hovering just above empty, each flicker a reminder of how far beyond regulation she had already flown. Below her, the valley stretched like a scar, the terrain jagged and red in the half-light. She could see the remnants of enemy armor scattered along the canyon floor, each smoldering wreck a mark of the storm she had survived. The radio hissed faintly, alive again but fragile, carrying the broken fragments of distant transmissions. Most of them were questions, shouts of confusion from command centers that had lost control of their own story. But beneath that noise, she caught a softer signal, faint and rhythmic, the pattern of SEAL beacons blinking in perfect coordination. Against every order and statistic, they had made it home. For a long moment, she just listened, eyes half closed, letting the sound fill the cockpit. Each pulse was a heartbeat, each transmission a proof of life. She realized then that the mission was no longer about flight or defiance. It was about bearing witness, about refusing to let courage disappear into the silence that followed obedience. She adjusted her altitude, the A-10 gliding low across the mountain ridge, her shadow sweeping over the land like the echo of a promise kept. Far ahead, on the horizon, she saw the dust trail of an approaching convoy armored transports, medical units, the slow machinery of rescue finally arriving to claim credit for what they had never dared to attempt. She could have turned away, vanished again into the upper atmosphere, where no radar could touch her, but instead she angled toward them, lowering altitude until her engines thundered through the valley. Soldiers below stopped in their tracks, shading their eyes as the aircraft roared overhead, its silhouette cutting clean against the rising Sunday. Someone pointed upward, shouting words that were lost to distance but carried in their shape the same truth whispered days earlier. Spectre's back. Mara switched to an open frequency, voice calm, devoid of ceremony. "This is Specter One," she said. "Confirm evac complete." The response came almost instantly, a dozen voices overlapping, some professional, some trembling with disbelief. "Confirmed. All survivors accounted for. Who is this?" She smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth softening. "Just someone making sure the sky still keeps its promises." Then she cut the transmission before they could ask again, her voice fading into static that would later be replayed, studied, and classified beyond reach. She circled once more above the valley, the sun now fully risen, bathing the world in light so bright it erased the borders between ruin and redemption. The A-10's wings caught the glow, turning from gray to gold, the metal gleaming as if alive. Each movement of the aircraft was deliberate, ceremonial, an unspoken salute to those who had fought, to those who had fallen, and to the quiet defiance that had bridged the two. She flew lower still, almost skimming the ground, her engines trailing a wake of heat that rippled across the sand like a signature written in fire. In the command centers miles away, operators watched the radar screens in silence, the unidentified signal pulsing across their scopes like a heartbeat that refused to flatline. Some whispered that it couldn't be her, others knew better and said nothing. Generals stared at the data, unwilling to acknowledge the truth forming right in front of them that one pilot, acting without orders, had restored the meaning of everything their procedures had forgotten. Back in the sky, Mara adjusted her course toward the east, where the desert met the sea. Her reflection stared back from the canopy, eyes calm, skin streaked with soot and light. She thought of Darrow, in whatever bunker he was hiding, transmitting fragments of history back into the world. She thought of Briggs, erasing her trail even as investigators closed in. And she thought of every nameless operator who had ever been told that doing the right thing was an error in protocol. The thought steadied her more than any order ever had. As she crossed the ridge, another voice crackled through the headset, this one older, heavier, filled with authority that had learned humility. "Specter One, this is command. You are out of jurisdiction. Land immediately." Or, he didn't finish. She heard the pause, the hesitation born of awe. "Or," she replied softly. The silence that followed was almost reverent. Then the voice returned. "Quieter now. Or fly safe, Captain. Stick." She let the smallest laugh escape her lips, not of triumph, but of release. "Copy that," she answered, and for the first time in years, the words "copy that" meant agreement rather than obedience. She climbed higher, letting the horizon widen until the desert gave way to the glimmering curve of water. The light broke fully across her canopy, and for a moment the sky became infinite, the color of possibility itself. Her instruments began to fail one by one, the radar fading, the navigation flickering, the engine temperature climbing, but she no longer needed them. She could feel every movement of the aircraft as though it were an extension of her own pulse. The machine was tired, its armor scorched, its circuits weary, yet it still obeyed, loyal to the very end. She whispered to it softly, words meant not for metal but for memory. "You did good, old friend. You got them home." Far below, soldiers watched the aircraft climb into the light, its contrails forming two perfect white lines that crossed and then dissolved. Some saluted instinctively, others simply stared, understanding that they were witnessing something larger than duty. Reports would later list the event as unidentified aerial contact, presumed friendly, but the men on the ground would remember it differently. They would remember how, in the aftermath of chaos, the sky itself had seemed to bend in gratitude. When the fuel warning light flashed red, Mara did not turn back. She leveled the A-10 along the coastline, the sea catching sunlight in endless ripples, each wave reflecting the same boundless stillness she carried inside. The cockpit was warm now, filled with light and the faint hum of a machine giving its last strength to the one who refused to surrender it. She reached up, touched the worn patch on her shoulder, and smiled. The gold thread gleamed once, then dulled again, as if satisfied. The radio flickered one final time, a message breaking through the static Darrow's voice, faint but certain. "Specter One, transmission verified. The files are public. You did it." She closed her eyes briefly, exhaling through a smile that was equal parts fatigue and peace. "Then they'll remember," she said. The horizon opened before her, wide and forgiving, the world reborn in color. Behind her, the war was over, the truth untethered, and every name once buried in classified silence began to surface again. Ahead, only sky. She pushed the throttle gently forward, the engines answering with a sound that was both roar and farewell. As the A-10 disappeared into the morning, no one could say whether she had turned toward home or into legend. All they knew was that somewhere above the rising sun, a lone aircraft kept flying long after the mission had ended, because some promises are too sacred to land. The news broke like a pulse through the veins of a world that had forgotten how to feel. At first, it appeared as a nameless clip on a civilian broadcast, grainy footage captured by a satellite over the Al-Majra corridor, showing an unregistered A-10 Thunderbolt cutting through the dawn like a silver blade. Within hours, the images spread across every secure channel, decoded and reposted, reaching even those who had sworn never to speak the word Spectre again. The official statement called it an unknown aircraft performing unauthorized maneuvers. But the people who understood silence, the soldiers who had waited for miracles, knew better. They recognized the sound before the image, the deep rolling thunder of the Ga-8 cannon, the voice of salvation in metal and fire. Inside the Pentagon, glass walls reflected panic disguised as order. Committees convened before sunrise, command chains overlapping in chaos as analysts traced data streams that refused to vanish. Someone had leaked the archived mission files, 12 years of erased operations, blacklisted pilots, and disavowed rescues, each stamped with the insignia of the long-deleted Spectre Division. The servers crashed within an hour, but the truth had already replicated itself, copied across networks and hard drives, impossible to bury again. For the first time in decades, the institution built on secrecy found itself outflanked by its own forgotten heroes. General Hawthorne arrived late to the crisis meeting, uniform crisp, face carved with sleepless determination. The room fell silent when he entered, the screens flickering behind him with footage too damning to deny. He looked around at the men who had once called themselves architects of order, men who had crafted reports polished enough to hide wars inside footnotes. "The world knows," he said simply, "and they know it because we lied too well for too long." One of the younger colonels spoke up, voice brittle with fear. "Sir, if she's alive, if Captain Vale," Hawthorne interrupted with a small motion of his hand, "then she did what soldiers are supposed to do when the command forgets what right looks like." The silence that followed was heavier than any reprimand. Somewhere deep inside the building, a printer continued spitting out pages, copies of testimonies, logs, coordinates, all fragments of a history that refused to die quietly. Outside, the streets filled with reporters, veterans, and ordinary citizens holding signs painted with a name the government had erased: Specter One. The air around the Capitol carried the strange electricity of belief, returning to a world that had traded courage for convenience. At the same time, across continents, military bases experienced their own tremors. Young officers gathered in break rooms, replaying the leaked footage on tablets, eyes reflecting both wonder and guilt. Mechanics whispered in hangars about what it meant to follow orders when the system itself had become a cage. Somewhere in a desert barracks, an enlisted man pinned a small black patch to his sleeve, a winged skull embroidered in gold, and others quietly followed. The rebellion wasn't loud, it was reverent. It didn't call for war, but for remembrance. Back in D.C., the Department of Defense issued its official position, a denial wrapped in politeness, a performance of control that fooled no one. Behind those words, however, something irreversible was shifting. The Oversight Board voted to declassify several operations, citing historical transparency. Files once buried under signatures began to surface, each line of text a confession written too late. The Spectre Division, once a myth whispered among soldiers, was now a documented truth. And with that truth came questions no authority wanted to answer. Hawthorne watched it all unfold from his office window, the city below shimmering in the reflection of rising sirens. He held in his hand a single photograph, black and white, edges curling with age. It showed a younger Mara Vale standing beside her aircraft, eyes steady, jaw set, the sun reflecting off the faint gold of her patch. He had kept it hidden for years, a reminder of a time when integrity had still outranked politics. Now, as the systems crumbled under the weight of their own denial, he placed the photograph on his desk and whispered to no one, "You finally won, Captain. You outflew all of us." Oh. Elsewhere, Briggs sat in a debriefing room that smelled of coffee and fear, answering questions with the calm of a man who had already made peace with his choices. Every time they mentioned unauthorized assistance, he answered the same way. Authorization didn't save those men. She did. When asked if he knew her whereabouts, he smiled faintly. If she's smart, she's already gone. If she's Mara Vale, she's already planning the next flight. His interrogators exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether they were speaking to an accomplice or a prophet. Darrow, hidden in a small apartment filled with outdated monitors, watched as the files he had helped recover spread beyond containment. The feeds scrolled endlessly, pilots sharing stories, soldiers writing in comment threads about the missions no one believed in, citizens leaving flowers at memorials for names they had never heard before. He leaned back, exhaustion softening his features, and said to the empty room, "She gave them back their ghosts." Outside his window, distant thunder rolled across the skyline, though the forecast had promised clear skies. By nightfall, the institution that had once claimed total control found itself fractured. Some called it collapse, others called it cleansing. The chain of command had been exposed as mortal, flawed, capable of fear. Yet in the ruins of that authority, something truer began to take shape, a quiet understanding that righteousness needed no permission to exist. Soldiers who had lived too long under silence began speaking again, not in defiance, but in remembrance, recounting the names of those erased for being inconveniently honorable. In the final hours before midnight, Hawthorne drafted a statement meant for history, not politics. His words were measured, each sentence weighted like a confession. "There will always be those who mistake obedience for virtue," he wrote, "but sometimes the code is preserved not by those who follow, but by those who remember what it was written for." He paused, then added the last line without hesitation. Specter One acted without approval, because approval had lost its meaning. When he sent the statement to the press, the system officially broke. The leaks became stories, the stories became proof, and the proof became belief. Around the world, the name Spectre stopped being a rumor whispered in hangars and became a call sign painted quietly on the sides of aircraft, a tribute written in steel instead of words. Somewhere far beyond radar range, where the sea met the sky, a faint blip appeared on an old tracking satellite. It pulsed once, twice, then disappeared. Engineers marked it as interference, another echo from a long decommissioned unit. But Hawthorne, watching from his office, recognized the pattern. 3 long pulses, 2 short. The old field code for mission complete. He smiled, his reflection blending with the night outside. In that moment, the collapse of the system felt less like destruction and more like release. The machinery of secrecy had finally broken enough to let truth breathe again. And while the officials scrambled to patch their narrative, the world itself had already chosen the version it believed, the one written in skyfire and silence, carried by a pilot who flew beyond permission and turned disobedience into grace. The legend of Specter One was no longer owned by the system that created her. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet and decided instead to act.